On this vote, the yeas are 49, the nays are 50. 3/5 of the senators duly chosen and sworn not having voted in the affirmative. This motion is not agreed to. The point of order is sustained and the amendment fails. Thank you.
Mr. President.
The senator is recognized.
Mr. President, I have 11 in-block motions at the desk, and I ask that they be read and considered in block.
Without objection. The clerk will report.
The senator from Tennessee, Mr. Hagerty, offers 11 motions to commit the bill to each of the following instructed committees: Environment and Public Works, Agriculture, Nutrition, Forestry, Health, Education, Labor and Pensions, Banking, Housing, Urban Affairs, Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs, Small Business and Entrepreneurship, Commerce, Science and Transportation, Veterans Affairs, Finance, Foreign Relations, and Indian Affairs, and that the 11 motions be considered en bloc.
Mr. President, I'm pleased to be joined by a host of my colleagues. The motions we're proposing are very simple and should attract wide support.
I heard you.
Senators on both sides have said this must be a bipartisan process, but so far, it isn't. Not once did any of the 11 Senate committees with jurisdiction over relevant aspects of this legislation meet to consider it. Not once. What's the purpose of the Senate system of expert committees if, as we consider one of the largest bills ever before this body, we're just going to act as if the committees never existed? We are for pandemic relief. What we're not for is a decade-long spending spree, rushed through this body, much of which has nothing to do with pandemic relief. Our motions would simply send this legislation back to committee for 3 days so it can be reviewed in a bipartisan manner. These motions would ensure that the legislation supports proven bipartisan programs before launching new programs or spending more money on programs that are already flush with cash. By midweek, we would have bipartisan legislation with committee input that is targeted to timely pandemic relief for those in need. I urge my colleagues to support these motions.
The senator from Vermont.
I rise in strong opposition to this amendment. There are some people here who do not understand the crises facing the American people. 63% of our people today are living paycheck to paycheck. Every day that we do not vaccinate somebody is somebody unnecessarily dying. Our kids are not in school. We're suffering a mental health epidemic. This country is demanding that Congress act now and stand up for the working families of this country. People are tired of obstructionism. They're tired of delays. They want action. Let's do it. I yield.
I ask for the yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There is.
The question is on the motions on block.
The question is on the motions on block. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Barrasso, aye. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn, aye. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blumenthal, no. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Blunt, aye. Mr. Booker.
No.
Mr. Booker, no. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Mr. Braun. Mr. Braun, aye. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown, no. Mr. Burr. Mr. Burr, aye. Ms. Cantwell. Ms. Cantwell, no.
When you get the tester.
Mrs. Capito. Mrs. Capito, aye. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Cardin, no. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Casey, no. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy, aye. Ms. Collins. Ms. Collins, aye. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Cornyn, aye. Ms. Cortez Masto. Ms. Cortez Masto, no. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Cotton, aye. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Kramer, aye. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Crapo, aye. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Cruz, aye. Mr. Daines. Mr. Daines, aye. Ms. Duckworth. Ms. Duckworth, no. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Durbin, no. Ms. Ernst. Ms. Ernst, aye. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Feinstein, no. Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Fisher, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mrs. Gillibrand, no. Mr. Graham. Mr. Graham, aye. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Grassley, aye. Mr. Hagerty. Mr. Hagerty, aye. Ms. Hassan. Ms. Hassan, no. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Hawley, aye. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Heinrich, no. Mr. Hickenlooper. Mr. Hickenlooper, no. Ms. Hirono. Ms. Hirono, no. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mrs. Hyde-Smith, aye. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inhofe, aye. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kane, no. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kelly, no. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. King. Mr. King, no. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Klobuchar, no. Mr. Langford. Mr. Langford, aye. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Leahy, no. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lee, aye. Mr. Lujan. Mr. Lujan, no. Ms. Lummis. Ms. Lummis, aye. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Manchin, no. Mr. Markey. Mr. Markey, no. Mr. Marshall. Mr. Marshall, aye. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McConnell, aye. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Menendez, no. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Merkley, no. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moran, aye. Ms. Murkowski. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy, no. Mrs. Murray. Mrs. Murray, no. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Ossoff, no. Mr. Padilla. Mr. Padilla, no. Mr. Paul. Mr. Paul, aye. Mr. Peters. Mr. Peters, no. Mr. Portman. Mr. Portman, aye. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed, no. Mr. Risch. Mr. Romney. Mr. Romney, aye. Ms. Rosen. Ms. Rosen, no. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rounds, aye. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sanders, no. Mr. Sass. Mr. Sass, aye. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schatz, no. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Schumer, no. Mr. Scott of Florida. Mr. Scott of Florida, aye. Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, aye. Mrs. Shaheen. No. Mrs. Shaheen, no. Mr. Shelby. Mr. Shelby, aye. Ms. Sinema. Ms. Sinema, no. Ms. Smith. Ms. Smith, no. Ms. Stabenow. Ms. Stabenow, no. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Tester. Mr. Tester, no. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Tillis, aye. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Toomey, aye. Mr. Tuberville. Mr. Tuberville, aye. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Van Hollen, no. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warner, no. Mr. Warnock. Mr. Warnock, no. Ms. Warren. Ms. Warren, no. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Whitehouse, no. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wicker, aye. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Wyden, no. Mr. Young. Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kennedy, aye. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Rubio, aye. Mr. Carper. Mr. Carper, no. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett, no. Mr. Risch. Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Coons. Mr. Coons, no.
Yes. Are there any senators in the chamber wishing to vote? If not, the yeas are 49, the nays are 50, and the motion is not agreed to.